Welcome to episode 15 of Scorned by Muses, Avant-Garde and Kitsch. My idea for this episode was to go to the park and sit and drink coffee and talk a bit about Clement Greenberg's essay Avant-Garde and Kitsch, which is very influential for my thinking and which grounds many of the ideas that I talk about in this series.
It's an essay that was written in 1939 in the Partisan Review.
But it was very loud at the park. There were dogs barking and children screaming and this guy practicing his screamo vocals.
I mean, we could try to go to that little park across the street from us.
The screamo man was definitely annoying, but as we were leaving, we saw the police hassling him, which made me a bit sad.
The cops are trying to stop this man from making art.
Yeah, he's just practicing.
We finally found some relative peace and quiet in a public garden near our apartment, and I launched into this little off-the-dome lecture.
So, I think in order to understand Greenberg's categories of avant-garde and kitsch, I think we need to understand what bourgeois art is. Because avant-garde and kitsch are the result of a fracturing of bourgeois art. And bourgeois art, in the simplest terms, is the kind of art making which emerges with the Renaissance and that really flourishes over the next couple of hundred years in terms of painting, which looks like a lot of the stuff that we would be familiar with when we go to the museums. Pretty much any painting that you would see in a museum is a bourgeois work of art, because the taking of a painting out of its religious context, out of the cathedral, out of the temple, out of the mosque, and having it on this movable panel that gets put into the homes of bourgeois merchants or of everyday working people, that kind of art is bourgeois. It looks like still lifes, it looks like landscapes, it looks like portraits. It's not religious iconography. It's not things which are meant to glorify the gods. It is not part of a ritual practice. It is this new kind of thing. And the emergence of bourgeois art coincides with the emergence of bourgeois society. And when I say bourgeois society, what I really mean is just commercial society. The kind of society which grows out of feudalism in Europe and is this new thing which is concentrated in the cities. Because that's what bourgeois really means. It just means city dwellers. The bourgeoisie are the people who live in the cities. And the Germans, who called these people the burghers, have this phrase, which means city air makes men breathe free. That it was in the cities where, through one's labor and the sale of one's labor, one could attain a new kind of freedom that wasn't possible under feudalism. You know, one was no longer a slave, one was no longer tied to the land and to one's feudal lord, that there was a kind of freedom that was achievable in the cities. And the art that went along with that was also an expression of this new kind of freedom. With the Industrial Revolution in the early 19th century, this new free society comes up against a kind of problem. It becomes self-contradictory in a certain way. That rather than this labor being emancipatory, it starts to create a new class of people the working class, or the proletariat in Marxist terms. So you have these sort of owners of capital and the people who own nothing but their labor power, which is how Marx kind of defines the proletariat. That they're free, he calls them free in the double sense. They are free in that they are not slaves, they are not bound to the land, they can sell their labor to whomever is willing to buy it. But yet they are free in a negative sense of the means of production, meaning they don't have land. They don't have any way to make a living other than to go to the market and to sell their capacities as human beings to someone who is willing to employ those capacities productively. And so there becomes a sort of tension between these two groups of people. And with the early bourgeois revolutions, the French Revolution being the most dramatic of those, these people, the workers and the bosses, their interests politically were aligned. They both had an interest in overthrowing the feudal aristocracy, which was serving as a fetter on their free activity. The system of taxation and the privileges which the first and second estates, the clergy and the aristocracy, had over the third estate, which was everyone else, which included the workers, the bourgeoisie, the peasants. Everyone was the third estate, which was like 99% of the country. That these two other classes were just constraining the free activity of those classes. So it was off with their heads, right? Let's just kill them all and society will flourish. By the time 1848 happens, you've had in that intervening period an industrial revolution where the capacity of production has increased dramatically. We're able to produce things like incredibly efficiently with machines, and yet at the same time, human labor is increasingly unnecessary in that process. That because we've become so productive, we need less and less human beings to produce the same amount of stuff. And now this is a problem because, as I was saying earlier, the proletariat, which is free in that double sense, the only thing they have to sell is their labor power. So when the market needs less and less labor power, people aren't able to sell that labor power. And the theorist, Frederick Jameson, he summarized Marx's work, Das Kapital, in one word, saying unemployment. That's really what the Industrial Revolution was about, unemployment. Well, maybe one more historical piece, and then we'll get around to the question of art. So in 1848, you have another revolution. It's the first time that it becomes clear politically that these two groups of people, the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the owners of capital and the owners of nothing but their own labor power, have contradictory interests. That with that revolution, there's the formation of a kind of constituent government in which all classes of society are meant to be represented. And the workers start making certain demands that the bourgeoisie realizes are incompatible with its own interests and begins to deny them those demands. The workers come out into the streets and protest, and the bourgeoisie order the military, order the special bodies of armed men, as Marx calls them, out into the streets to slaughter those people, to gun them down. And that is traumatizing for bourgeois society, for Western society. It's traumatizing for European society. And after that moment, art can no longer operate in society in the same way in which it did in the prior period. So art begins to change. Once it's clear that this new society, which was supposed to be free, liberté, égalité, fraternité, as were the mottos of the French Revolution, that those things no longer seem to be true, that the bourgeoisie no longer seem to be interested in upholding those, that the art of the bourgeoisie is questioned. And so the way that Clement Greenberg describes it, is art breaks into these two funny forms, avant-garde and kitsch. So kitsch culture is what we would kind of think of as low culture today. It's movies, comic books, pop songs, romance novels. These kinds of things are kitsch. Whereas the avant-garde is kind of bourgeois art in distress. That artists recognize that they can no longer do the same kinds of things that they were doing before. They can't make art in the style in which the French Academy was making art for the last 100 years. And so they begin to investigate their own medium in a new way. And so you have these two things. And the reason that you have kitsch art is that you have all of these people, the proletariat, these industrial workers, who have come from the countrysides, come from this peasant way of life in which they had a kind of folk culture rooted in tradition for hundreds of years in these little towns throughout Europe. And then they're suddenly thrust into the cities and they have this void, this lack. They have a need for culture, a need for art, but they don't have anything there that can adequately take up the folk culture that they've lost. And so the market steps in and offers them these kinds of things, offers them, penny dreadfuls, these novels, Tin Pan Alley songs, comic books, right? All of these new forms of entertainment, all of these things kind of fill in the gap of that culture which was lost from the traditional peasant way of life in the countryside. And then you have the artists who would have been practicing in this kind of high bourgeois academic style painting, starting to question that painting because the society which undergirded that painting has become problematic. And so the painting itself formally expresses that crisis, formally expresses that contradiction. And you can pretty clearly see that as modernism plays out, that the painting is an objectification of the disintegration of society, right? The medium itself becomes apparent. Like you can see the cracks, you can see how the thing is made. And so the painters are attempting to think about how and why painting can be this source of meaning for us. Because that's the other sort of long process of the Enlightenment and of the Renaissance, is the collapse and erasure of traditional society and traditional forms of meaning. Friedrich Nietzsche famously said, "God is dead and we have killed him." Right? That means the authority of God, the authority of the church, the thing which was for hundreds of years the center of all meaning, of all authority, has been undermined by this new form of society. And yet we don't have something that is adequate to take up that responsibility, adequate to take up the responsibility of meaning, and adequate to take up the responsibility of the authority of how we should think about ourselves as human beings. And art was a place where that could happen. But when art recognizes that the society which it's attempting to objectify aesthetically is in crisis, art is then thrown into crisis and must look at the medium of art as a way to understand what it's doing. So it's trying to empty art of everything that's not itself in this search for the meaning of art, right? And it results in kind of the, Malevich's black square or a blank canvas, or it just reduced to the pure materiality of painting. Or, even further, in the mid-20th century, the minimalists like Robert Morris and Donald Judd, and these people who are making just cubes, emptying it of everything but the material thing that's there. And trying to see, okay, well, how can this be meaningful? How can this practice of art be meaningful? What can we strip away and still have it be meaningful? And it turns out you can strip away pretty much everything, and it is still meaningful because we're able to impose a meaning onto it, but yet it's a kind of empty meaning. It's only meaningful in that it exists. And so I guess I would also say that that's what I'm interested in about art, is that art reveals to us our capacity for meaning making in the absence of traditional authority, in the absence of God, in the absence of some divine ordering of the world. Art reveals to us that we are capable of being divine. We are capable of doing that which God previously did. I don't know if I've talked at all about Clement Greenberg's essay. But
How are you going to edit this? It's so long already.
I guess I'm one of these old guys that can just talk forever now.
Yeah.
I do think all this historical grounding is essential to understanding Greenberg's argument, but I wanted to get back around to honing in on the idea of the avant-garde.
So in the pages of Critical Inquiry in 1982, T.J. Clark and Michael Fried had an exchange about Clement Greenberg and about modernism. And in T.J. Clark's essay, the way he describes what the avant-garde is he calls it bourgeois art without a bourgeois public, which is kind of the situation I was trying to describe earlier, which is that bourgeois society has become contradictory in a way such that artists can't assume a single kind of audience for their art. That there isn't a coherent spirit of society that the artists can objectify. That society is contradictory. The spirit of society is contradictory, and art has to reckon with that contradiction, which means that art has to which means that art can't be merely affirmative. It can't merely affirm this society which cannot affirm itself. There's an inner turmoil which needs to be objectified, and that the avant-garde attempts to objectify. So that, and this isn't something that necessarily happens so self-consciously. In certain cases it does happen self-consciously, but it's in a kind of intuitive sense that the art which had been practiced for hundreds of years as bourgeois society was gaining influence throughout Western civilization, that kind of painting no longer seems adequate to society as it exists. That there's a disconnect between the material reality and the ideas that we have about that reality. And the ideas being the aesthetic expressions that we have. So the avant-garde tries to find new aesthetic expressions that are adequate to this new material reality. But it happens like pretty intuitively in the way that, like, I mean, this is a bit of a vulgar analogy, but in the way that fashion works, right? Like, you can't really explain why. Okay, like, this is maybe stupid, but like the debate between like skinny jeans. Okay, so like millennials wear skinny jeans and Gen Z wears baggy pants. It's kind of like a broad statement. But you can't really explain why skinny jeans are bad. like if you ask a Gen Z person, like, why does skinny jeans bad? They can't really articulate it. It's just an intuitive sense that, like, oh, baggy pants are just better. Skinny jeans, that is like the status quo. That's bad. There's something that doesn't work. Yeah, they say it's chuggy or something, but there's something that doesn't work about it. There's just something intuitively that doesn't work about it. The skinny jeans are no longer adequate to society. And so they try this other thing. And that's mostly just a rejection of the status quo. I think that that's ultimately what avant-garde artists are trying to do. They're looking at the world as it is in the aesthetic objectifications that we have and saying, these are not good enough. These are inadequate to the world. We want the world to be something other than it is. And the shit that's out there right now is bad, so we're going to try something new. And that's, I think, like what a lot of anybody who gets a tattoo or dyes their hair red or blue or gets a lip piercing is counter-identifying with the status quo, right? That's why it's like edgy. They're trying to differentiate themselves from the status quo. It's just a rejection of what is. And it's always going to be a kind of inadequate rejection. It's a registration of discontent. And that, in a vulgar way, is kind of what the avant-garde is doing. It's vulgar because all of fashion is kind of just kitsch culture. That fashion, I mean, maybe there is some like truly avant-garde fashion, but a lot of fashion is just like a repetition of the same kinds of forms.
Way, that's what the avant-garde are.
Yeah, well, that fashion, I'm just saying it's an analogy, but it's not a precise analogy. It's not exactly what the avant-garde is doing. It's a rough way of thinking about it. I wanted to talk about this because I think a lot of people have expressed confusion and frustration about my categories. So the category of bourgeois art, when I talk about art and my desire to destroy art, I'm talking about a narrow form of art which emerges with the Renaissance and which may have already ended, right? This historically specific period of bourgeois art. That's not to say that a transformation of society beyond bourgeois society wouldn't have what I would call instead aesthetic objectifications, that we would turn the world, transform the world into objects of aesthetic pleasure and objects of beauty. That in fact, I think we would endeavor to turn the entire world into a beautiful object. But that it happening as this like narrow thing which you put on the wall of a gallery, like we should get rid of that. Right? That like most of the world is ugly and awful, and then you walk into the rarefied space of the gallery where you can get a glimpse of beauty, a glimpse at what the world could be, that rather than art being that, the world would be the beautiful object. The world would be beautiful. That we would endeavor to design the world to be aesthetically pleasurable.
Like everything would be art.
Everything would be art. But we wouldn't even think about that.
Yeah,
think
and
about it in
therefore
those
there's
terms.
no art.
Therefore there's no art. We wouldn't think about it in those terms. Because art only exists because we cannot make the world be what we want it to be. So our desire for the world to be beautiful gets expressed in this narrow form of art. In a painting or in a sculpture, we make the world in miniature what we want it to be. And so rather than that like narrow, shitty little practice, which is, I mean, I call it a shitty little practice because compared to the potential of what it could be, it's just like fiddling with sticks, you know?
It's like a tip of the iceberg.
It's important, and it's like there's an incredible potential within that, but it's like, it's a child playing with Legos when we could be designing the universe,